So I think that the number one sediment video request I get is for something on the topic of sediment model calibration. Now we have a whole talk and session on model calibration in the 1D sediment modeling class, which we're going to post over on the RAS training site in the next few months. But I recently gave a lecture where I kind of talked all about how to build a RAS model in a couple of hours and included about 15 minutes on calibration. So I thought that I'd run that here, and then at the end I'll get on and cover just a couple of topics that I didn't cover in that lecture.
If we're going to do one talk on RAS, it's got to include some calibration. Tony Thomas, again, who's my mentor, who developed HEC6, which was the predecessor to RAS. He wrote a chapter in. This is the sediment engineering ASC sediment engineering manual that Marcelo Garcia put together. It is kind of the definitive text these days on sedimentation engineering. Tony Thomas wrote the chapter on numerical modeling, and in there he says basically he's a Southern gentleman, so he uses kind, soft words. I'm from New York, so I'm going to make it a little more blunt. If you don't calibrate your sediment transport model, you don't get to call it a model. It's not a model. Now, it can still be useful. You call it a computational experiment or a computational analysis, but it's not a model of the world because you haven't compared it to the world. And when your equations are as uncertain as the sediment transport equations, you have to compare it to something real in the world to say it's a model of the world. And so there are two basic questions in calibration. One is, what data do you evaluate your model with? And then when your model inevitably doesn't match those data, because it won't, there's all these free parameters and data in your model, which of those should you adjust? Okay, so first, how can you evaluate your model? Well, the first thing is you shouldn't touch sediment until you've got a calibrated hydraulic model. One of the things that you'll find is that the hydraulic model is very forgiving. You can have lots of errors in that, and the hydraulic model won't care. It's self-correcting. Sediment will tell on you. Sediment will show you where your hydraulics are wrong. Sediment is nonlinear, so it's going to take any mistake in the hydraulic model and raise it to a power of 2. And that's not going to go well. And so before you put a grain of sediment in your model, you need an awesome hydraulic model. And it should be calibrated to at least 3 flows. You should calibrate it to a bankful flow. You should calibrate it to a low flow. And those are mandatory because you have access to those. You should also calibrate it to a flood flow, but maybe you don't have access to historic high water marks. But within the context of a project, you can go out and get a bankful flow or close and a low flow and get those stages and calibrate your hydraulic model. You have to calibrate your hydraulic model first. And then the most common thing that we calibrate sediment models to is volume change. Okay, hear that. Volume change, not bed change. We're not looking at bed elevation or the thalweg. The cross-section is a series of elevations. Most people will go and look at how their thalweg changes, but that's, you saw how we changed the 1D cross-section. That's not representative of how cross-sections change. RAS cares about mass, and the way we think about mass in space is volume. And so if I'm starting a sediment transport study, the first thing I ask on the call is, hey, do you have old cross-sections? Because what you're going to do is you're going to go reoccupy those cross-sections so that you have repeated cross-sections. If you have repeated bathymetry that are more than 5 to 10 years apart and have an event in there, your probability of success with the sediment model doubles basically, maybe increases an order of magnitude. I would give half my project budget for repeated cross-sections because no amount of money can put me in a time machine and get me that old data. So repeated cross-sections are really the currency of 1D sediment modeling. And so then you compute this area and you multiply the area by the distance of the length of the control volume, and you've got a volume. And so this is a discrete volume change calibration I did on the Muskegon, and each of these points is the volume change, both computed and observed. This is a pretty good calibration. I'm pretty happy with it. Now, sometimes, like on the Missouri where we're doing 500 kilometers, doing discrete volume is hard. And so one of the things we often look at, because the cross-section change is very noisy on big models, is what we call longitudinal cumulative volume change. And so what we're doing here is we're starting from upstream and we're just summing the volume in the downstream direction. So basically a negative slope is erosion. And one of the advantages of this, it smooths out all the noise, but also you can get down here at the end, and that's the total volume change of your whole reach. And so the next thing that you want to do, if you can, is what we call multi-time series volume calibration. So this is a calibration that John Shelley and I did on the Missouri River. It's actually much prettier than this, and we had this really dialed-in model with a really beautiful calibration. And then the flood of 2011 happened, and we were like, oh, we have this beautiful 500-kilometer sediment transport model that does amazing, and let's put the flood in it. And we weren't even close. That's because we had a low flow model, but sediment transport's nonlinear, and so we hadn't actually captured the high flow results. So then we calibrated our model to both events, and each calibration looks worse, but the model is better because now it's more, I call this the model calibration paradox. The more data you calibrate your model to, the worse each calibration looks, but the better it is because it's robust over multiple processes. You can also calibrate to calibration. So this is, I'm involved right now with a number of reservoir drawdowns. We need to let the fish through the reservoir, and so we're drawing down the reservoirs during migration time for the fish. But the problem is you draw down a reservoir, you send sediment concentration spikes downstream. And so this is Fall Creek, and we did a little model of this, and basically the U.S. Geological Survey measured these concentrations downstream, and we didn't have repeated cross-sections in this case, but it didn't really matter because what we cared about wasn't the bed change. What we cared about was the downstream concentrations. You always want to calibrate your model to the thing you care about, and so here we calibrated the model to the downstream concentrations over the course of 3 years. You can also calibrate your concentration by grain class. This is a calibration Tony Thomas did on the Sacramento, and here he has the brown squares are concentrations of medium sand, and the blue circles are concentrations of very fine sand. And we just have this in a rating curve now, and we've plotted the entire simulation over the whole range of flows, both for the medium sand and the very fine sand. And you could basically what you're looking for is for the observed data to envelope the computed data. And this is one we did on the Mississippi. You always have fewer concentration measurements than you have simulated days, essentially. But here are simulated days in the little dots, and here are the concentration measurements. And yeah, you basically want your simulation to fall within your concentration, but this is just sediment. On the Mississippi, you have a lot of what we call wash load that doesn't, we're interested in bed change here. And so the wash load doesn't matter. So we want to make sure that our sand calibration is correct. And so up here, we've broken it down into observed sand and observed fines, silt and clay. And so this is our calibration with silt and clay, and this is our calibration with sand, just to make sure that sediment is not sediment in all cases. You want to make sure that what I call the problematic grain classes, the ones that are causing whatever engineering or ecological problem that you're running into. Like on Fall Creek, the problematic grain classes are the fines. And so that's what we calibrated to. You want to make sure your model performs well to solve the problem that you are actually trying to resolve. Okay, and then the other thing that you can sometimes compare your model to is the gradations in the bed. Like, remember, this is an initial condition. You put in your gradations, your bed gradations, your bed grain size distributions, but you want to make sure at the end of your model that the model has actually reproduced this. And sometimes with reservoir modeling, with a reservoir model, the bed gradations will change over the course of your simulation as the delta advances. Essentially, the sand will move downstream, and silt will move downstream, and clay will move downstream. And so what we have here is kind of the observed grain class distribution. Here is the gravel and the sand and the clay and the silt and the clay. And then what the model did at the end, the silt, the sand, and the clay. And RAS actually does this as an output automatically now, just to make sure that your final model looks like your final prototype. Those are the ways you can evaluate your model. But then what model parameters are you going to tinker with? And here's the problem. There's like 12, maybe 14 different knobs you can turn in RAS to get it to do different things. And that leads us to what we call the equifinality problem. The equifinality problem is a problem of all multi-parameter models, whether you're doing hydrology or groundwater. If you've got multiple free parameters, you can increase one too much and decrease another too much, and you can have compensating errors. So you can get the right answer for the wrong reason, and then when you use your model outside of that like very narrow range in which it was calibrated in, it performs poorly. And so how do you decide which parameters to adjust? Well, you adjust the ones that are uncertain and sensitive. And so I always make a 2x2 matrix like this. And I take all of the decisions I've made in my model, and I break them down into low sensitivity and high sensitivity, and then low uncertainty and high uncertainty. I don't want to change 12 things. I want to change 2 or 3. Really what I want is I want the number of variables that I'm changing to be about the same as the number of things I'm comparing them to in the real world. So if I have concentration and bed change data, I basically want to change 2 parameters. And so this is the realm of things I want to change. I want to end up with like 2 or 3 things in this bucket that I'm going to change. And so if it's low sensitivity and low uncertainty, you just guess and move on because it doesn't matter, right? If it's low sensitivity but high uncertainty, you just guess and move on because sure, you don't know anything about it, but it doesn't matter. If it's high sensitivity but low uncertainty, you set it to whatever the measurement is and you move on. That parameter is sensitive, but you constrained it. It's just this zone where the model is sensitive to it and you don't know it that you want to change. And so these are the sorts of things that people change in RAS to calibrate it, but really it's these 4. Select a different transport function. Remember, you've already ruled out the ones that aren't appropriate. You're only dealing with 2 to 4 that are appropriate. That flow load curve, remember, that was a big scatter. Even though we did really good statistics to get a curve through that, that was a big scatter. Those gradations or the bed gradations. And so every one of my reports has a 2x2 matrix like this, where I list all the data and parameters I chose for the model and the ones that I targeted as my calibration parameters. Now, if you go on to any sort of modeling, like maybe you find that sediment's not for you. I think I shoveled 100 tons of sediment for my PhD. Okay, maybe sediment's not for you. But any kind of modeling you do, hydrology, ecological modeling, probably any sort of behavioral modeling, groundwater modeling, this is still the way that you should identify your parameters. Okay, let me wrap up with some modeling principles. 1D RAS is what we call a reach scale, decadal scale model. You should not infer much from how any one cross-section changes. We're looking at how the reach changes. And that's why we do these longitudinal cumulative volume curves, is because it's a reach scale model. And it's a decadal scale model. You should not infer much from what a single event does. And that's why having good hydrology or reproducing good hydrology is so important, is that I want to run this model for 10, 30, 50 years. And that's why you use a 1D model, because a 2D model, the runtimes on a 2D model for a 50-year simulation are just too long. But a 2D model doesn't have this kind of reach scale, decadal scale limitation. And then I would say that the number one thing that new modelers get wrong is what I call the principle of incremental complexity. You have all this data. You have all this information. You have a tin, you have flow, you've got grid. You put it all in the model. You just make the best model you can, and then you press compute, and it fails. And you don't know why, because all the data's in there. The principle of incremental complexity says you want to build the simplest possible model that could work. And then make sure that things are happening as you expect them to. So like one flow and one grain class, right? And is it behaving in the way it's not going to reproduce the real world, but is it behaving in a way, is it running first of all, and then is it behaving in a way you kind of expect that to behave? And then piece by piece, you add a new piece of data, you add a new piece of complexity, you add your temperature data, you add another grain class, you turn on hiding. You add those things one at a time and evaluate them one at a time. First of all, you're evaluating the sensitivity of each of those as you add them. But if your model has a problem after you add one thing, you actually know what caused the problem. If you put everything in your model first and then run, you actually don't know, you don't have a candidate for what's causing trouble. And the thing that I would recommend is, I did a podcast episode with 3 other model developers, and we talked about some basic principles of morphodynamic modeling, but they're just really some basic principles of modeling. It's a 1-hour podcast that you can put in your ear while you're running or driving, and it introduces, I think, a lot of really good principles of physical system modeling.
So just a couple of things I want to add to the content in that lecture. The Corps of Engineers does have a formal approach to calibration that does follow these principles of incremental complexity. It comes from an old document called TD13 that Tony Thomas wrote back in the early days of sediment modeling, and it has kind of a 4-step process. The first, as we mentioned, is hydraulic calibration. But the way that they think about this is, what part of the model are you going to keep fixed and what are you going to allow to vary? Since there are so many degrees of freedom now, you want to kind of vary them one at a time. So if you think about a hydraulic calibration, well, first you're going to start with steady flow. So that's going to be fixed flow and fixed bed elevation. But eventually you're going to want to calibrate to unsteady flow or to multiple flows. So you're going to let your flow be variable and your elevation be fixed. But then you want to let your bed move, but to only introduce 1 degree of freedom at a time. The second stage is a steady flow mobile bed analysis. Sometimes we call this a convergence analysis. You're going to fix a flow. You're just going to have one flow. Usually we start with a bankful flow and then we do it again for a low flow and a high flow. And then you let your bed move. You run a sediment model with a fixed flow. And the model should eventually converge. It shouldn't kind of deposit or erode kind of indefinitely. It should converge on a solution. And that'll kind of show you what your model's going to do under these conditions and if you think that that is reasonable. Then we get to what we call the dynamic calibration. This is where you put in a full hydrograph, time series, and you allow your bed to adjust. And these are the sorts of calibrations we talked about. But the calibrations that we actually showed you in the lecture, they follow these other steps of a variable flow fixed bed elevation and then a fixed flow variable bed elevation step. And then you've got another step that we talked about called validation. Now, we don't tend to use the word validation. Validation, verification, these are actually fraught terms. And the truth is that in operational modeling, it's not like academic modeling. You're not going to use one set of data to build your model and the other one to test it. And if your model performs poorly in the test, you just leave it. No, you're going to use all the data you have to evaluate and improve your model. And so Tony Thomas came up with this phrase called multiple time series analysis. And so that's what we do to talk about making our model more robust by calibrating it against multiple time series. And so the last thing I want to show you is just an editor in the RAS interface. And so if your sediment model is either depositing too much or eroding too much, well, there are really 3 main things that you need to think about. Your load. You're either bringing in too much load or too little load. How coarse is that load? If you're eroding, maybe that load is too fine. If you're depositing too much, maybe that load is too coarse. And then your capacity. Your transport function is either bringing in too much sediment or too little sediment. And so here's a model. And if you have a rating curve, you can go in and you have the flow and your load. And so this is the relationship between flow and load, but this is very uncertain. So you can kind of move this up or down, or you can move material from your courses or grain classes into your finer grain classes or vice versa. If you have an equilibrium boundary condition, we have what's called the capacity ratio, which can adjust your equilibrium load up or down 10% or so. But if your load, it kind of falls into that highly sensitive but pretty well established, and it's not actually the thing you want to change, what you actually want to change is your capacity. Well, you can choose the right transport function, you can choose the closest transport function, but you might want to adjust that. And so you can go into options, calibrate transport functions, and it's worth noting that this feature can be a little bit controversial, but you can come in here and say, I want to modify my transport function, and you'll notice that we have 2 different ways to do that. We have some individual transport function parameters that we've exposed that you can adjust the parameters of transport functions individually. We're moving away from that. We'd like to have this disappear from the interface actually. It's only really there for legacy models. What we'd rather have you think about are the scaling factors. So these are two different scaling factors, and by default they're one. And one goes in front of the transport function itself, and the other in front of what we call critical mobility factor. So either the critical shields number or the critical stream power or Ackers-White mobility parameter, something like that. And so the idea is that this is just a pure scaling factor. If you want 10% more capacity, you can make that 1.1. Or if you want 10% less capacity, you can make it 0.9. But then the critical mobility factor, this is multiplied times, let's say, the critical shields number. And so if you make this 1.1, you're going to increase the critical shields number. You're going to increase how difficult it is to move a particle, which does what to the transport? Well, it decreases the transport, and it decreases the transport non-linearly because that's inside of the equation, which is raised to a power. In this case, you're making adjustments to equations which have been trained to data. And so you're kind of on your own with respect to, does this modified equation reflect your system? But if you look at the data that were used to develop the transport equations, they're often very scattered. And so this is a way to kind of tune the transport functions to your system a little bit in order to improve your calibration if you feel comfortable with your flux boundary condition. And so that's just a brief introduction to how we think about calibrating a sediment transport model in 1D HEC RAS.